What's going on, folks? Welcome to the Diet NPO podcast. My name is Zach, and I will be your host today. Ooh, it's getting chilly, folks. In this central Illinois weather, temperatures are starting to drop, and I feel like I'm kind of preparing for my own hibernation of my own at this point. I'm definitely going to be enjoying the winter. I'm going to miss cycling and the outdoor activities that we get to do, but really like it where my dogs can go outside and hang out in our little backyard where it's all snowy and everything just feels like deathly quiet because that snow really compresses everything. You think about times when you were a kid during this time, so I'm definitely looking forward to some upcoming holidays and some time off for sure. Tutoring has stayed hot, looking at about 10 students that are actively studying for the exam, with maybe another 5 to 10 who are in a bit of a transition period as they figure out their next steps. Super common as we kind of see. With my excellent partnership with All Access Dietetics, I've stayed completing these twice a week study hall lives where we're getting somewhere between 25 to 40 students who are jumping in with us and testing their knowledge and sitting in on some lessons. So those have been really excellent to sit in with all of those different students. And I feel like I get to throw a wider net to really help all of them. In my full-time job, we're getting closer to where students will be off with break. And we got to visit the University of Illinois recently and meet with their excellent dietitians, Flora and Kelly. We had a great time hanging out with the two of them, and any chance that I get to hang out with some other dietitians from another area, another field, it always starts kind of bringing up some inspiration. But it's a cold season, and it's winter, folks. And that's the time when people are going to start baking, cooking in, doing their own stuff at home instead of going out as much. And so that's going to be our big concept today is baking during these winter areas. Baking itself, it's like it's its own topic for the RD exam. And students can tend to really struggle with the grasping of these baking concepts and applying them to questions. Maybe you don't do a lot of baking yourself, and so it all feels just super foreign. So I'm here to give you some ways to remember your baking concepts, learn a little bit today, whether you're studying for an exam or you just want to learn how to bake a little better. The first spot we should start at, though, is leavening, and what leavening is. Leavening, whenever I think of it, I think of levitating, or air floating in a way. In a way, that's what leavening is. It's this process of incorporating air, steam, carbon dioxide for the purpose of raising up those baked goods. Maybe you've baked bread before at home and noticed that you didn't use enough yeast, or your yeast was inactive. You ended up with this flat, very dense bread that just didn't rise at all and wasn't very good. Yeast is one of our leavening agents, and it is my favorite. Yeast is this single-celled microorganism that has been used in baking for, centuries, you would think. When yeast is combined with sugar, with warm water, it begins to produce carbon dioxide, the basic leavening process behind our breads in this case. If you've ever mixed yeast with warm water before you were preparing like a bread loaf, you may have noticed some little bubbles forming at the top, and that is carbon dioxide. But it's not the only way that we can go about leavening some things. Another method is the use of chemical leavening with baking soda plus an acid to form up kind of this air. Remember, think back to those days when you were in school and you did your volcano project. Remember, you added the baking soda plus the vinegar and it kind of blew the volcano up, right? This is the same concept that is going on here. Whenever you are adding baking soda plus an acid to a baked good, it's producing those bubbles, it's producing that air, and it's making it rise up. So some examples of this could be our common use of baking powder, which is just baking soda combined with cream of tartar or tartaric acid. Could also be when we're using baking soda and buttermilk potentially in a baked good, or maybe lemon juice potentially. These are all ways that you're leavening through use of an acid and a base to create air. We have a third way though, and that's through the use of steam. So it's still producing air, but it's that compressed air that is producing steam in this case. A really good example of this is like popovers, which don't use yeast, don't use a lot of leavening. They are placed in these cupcake tins, and when they bake, they produce all that steam and kind of pop over in a way. So it's another example that you can really grip onto when you're thinking of air, steam leavening, and how that all works together. We got some other basics of baking that we need to know about, so we got to touch on our flours a bit. What is flour providing to our baked goods? It does different methods. Wheat flour, when combined with water, forms the compound gluten, because gliadin and glutenin are the two kind of products that are in that wheat. Whenever we add water, we're mixing those two together to make gluten. And gluten, when you knead it, when you stretch it, when you put it in that KitchenAid mixer, you're actually stretching those proteins and forming these networks where air is being trapped in those pockets. Then when the leavening is coming in, that air is just increasing and increasing. So that's what you're seeing with gluten, is it's that stretching protein network, and that protein network really associates with keeping it nice and stable and trapped all through there. But what about if you used a gluten-free flour? Well, if you've ever done gluten-free baking, you may have noticed that your gluten-free cakes and items are not going to get as large volume as you might see with something that does contain gluten. That's why with a lot of gluten-free products, we have to add some extra leavening to kind of account for that, what we might be missing from that strong network of gluten. So that's kind of another example there. What about ovo or eggs? Eggs are just that great essential thing in all of baking process. Eggs are made up of proteins, as we know, and we've always known that for a long time. But it has a few other skills too. Eggs serve as a major binder in baking. It helps to keep things stable once they're cooked. Think about that raw egg. Once you crack it in the pan, you see it's very runny, watery, no structure at all. But when you denatured those proteins, what happens? They formed and kind of solidified. And that's what's going on with our egg and the baked goods too. As you're cooking it, it's becoming more stable and denatured, so it's helping to keep those structures in there. Eggs also have lecithin in the yolk, which is going to be really essential for when you add your fats, your water, and you're mixing them together, because you don't want those things separated throughout your baked goods. We want them all incorporated. Lecithin does a great job for that. What about the sponge cake, if you've ever seen one? Cakes can provide for color. We did a sponge cake just last week, and it had this very yellow color to it, and we added a lot of eggs. Why was it yellow? Well, that was because the egg yolk is very yellow, has that kind of carotenoid in it, and it's making it very yellow in that case. So of course we know the yolk of eggs is going to be really essential there. What about the whites? Maybe we can give you another baking example. Ever remember making meringues in one of your labs? What part of the egg did you primarily use? You used the white for that part, and you whipped those whites very, very quickly, incorporating air between those kind of protein networks. And when you baked it, it ended up with this solid product. So you can kind of see that as a good example of how eggs really can provide such structure that they could be used on their own to make a meringue, for instance, which is all just egg whites for that instance. There's no flour or anything else really incorporated. Good examples, hopefully, for kind of that process of eggs. They are so essential. Our cake is almost baked, folks, but we're going to need a few more ingredients. Let's add a little bit of salt to the recipe, because salt has some great attributes as a flavor enhancer, also as an additive to help keep things fresher, right? Think of chocolate chip cookies when you added some salt to them. Do you notice how that salt and that chocolate combines to really richen it and help that flavor? Sometimes it can be too much, but it's like the salted chocolate concept. It always kind of makes you salivate and want more and more. Another thing is that salt can help to deafen that yeast a little bit so it doesn't overrise. So it'll kind of block the yeast from doing too much work, from having like an overrisen product. So that's a really good reason we keep salt in a lot of our breads and baked goods, is to prevent too much leavening or too much yeast in that case. Since we're getting out the salt, I say we get out some sugar too. Sugar rarely, as we know, we know that sugar is so great for obviously providing that good taste and good flavor enhancement. Sugar is also helping to combine with the water to kind of have this hydrolysis process of keeping things nice and moist throughout. And if we add too much of it, you may have noticed like that grit when you bite into a chocolate chip cookie, or if you were bad and you had chocolate chip cookie dough, maybe you've noticed that grit in the sugar that when you chew it, right? It's that sugar that's in there providing flavor, a little bit of that texture as well. Fat is needed for our cakes, it's needed for our baked goods, as fat is essential for that chewy, moist texture. Without it, you would have some really dry, coarse products. I'm going back to chocolate chip cookies a lot here, everyone, but when you've had a really moist chocolate chip cookie, you know it. And that's because you can taste the real butter, that melt in your mouth concept as you're biting into the cookie, right? The butter and the fat is providing that to it. Fat and salt kind of help provide that assistance of moistening things. And fat also, one thing that it's going to do for it is it'll help control that gluten development as well. You think about things such as cookies. Well, you don't want your cookies to be giant, tall cakes. That's not the purpose of a cookie. Cookie means meant to stay kind of flat. So adding extra fat to it will also help to deafen that yeast and the salt to help deafen that yeast so it doesn't overrise too much. So it's a good couple of things to remember there. Whew. Well, now all we need to do is in our baked good is add a couple more things. But now we've kind of talked about all these different ingredients. But what happens if my cake fails? We see this commonly on the RD exam where they're going to ask you a question about, hey, find the issue with your cake. We want you to be nice and prepared for that. So let's go through it. I pulled out a cake. We're going to bake something later. And my cake is pulled out and it's fallen in the center. This is the center of it. It's like a crater. What happened in this case, everyone? It's fallen in the center. And this can be due a lot of the times to excess ingredients. Excess fat, excess sugar, excess baking powder may cause that center of the cake to be too moist, where it was unable to hold that center structure and it just collapsed in. Maybe it rose too much as a result of the baking powder and it kind of blew out the top and collapsed in that case. That could have been a use of way too much baking powder or leavening in that case. What would we do if it could have also not been mixed enough, potentially, where that leavening really had no chance to get incorporated in the first place and it just really never rose in the center. Or the temperature was too low, where our ingredients just did not have an adequate amount of temperature to really rise. So if my cake is fallen in the center, I'm going to look at a couple different areas. One is going to be excess. Excess fat, sugar, and baking powder may have caused this cake to collapse in the center. Could have been just too moist. The temperature could have been too low, or I just didn't mix things enough that it never had a chance to really get off in that case. Now, what if your baked good is really dry and really tough? One area could have been that you added too little amounts of water, fat, sugar, that really didn't provide enough moisture when it's dry, as you can imagine. What happens when you've ever overbaked or overcooked something? Did you notice how dry and coarse that texture got? Well, that's also kind of what's going on here. If you overbake your cake and you eliminate all that moisture and the fat isn't gripped in there, you're not going to have much of a moist texture. It's going to be quite dry in that case. Maybe you mixed everything too much, or you added too much eggs or flour. And because if we picture too much eggs, it made it too stable, too hard. Too much flour is just too much dry ingredients in general. So you can see how if my cake was dry, maybe it just had too much dry in the first place. Now I'm going to try another cake, and it just never rose in the first place. It had very poor volume. Picture like I pulled it out and this cake was just only an inch higher from when I took it out earlier. The first area I'd be checking is my leavening, as if I'm having poor volume, that potentially would have been the reason that my cake never rose in the first place. Maybe I didn't add enough of it. Maybe I added improper amounts of sugar, of fat, or of salt that really impacted that rising process that I didn't impact for. So now you can see if I have low volume of a cake, that's probably going to be due to a leavening issue of some kind that was affected. Now, maybe my cake is really too yellow, a little bit odd in color. I could have added too much eggs. I could have added a very alkaline flour, as alkaline things tend to turn it kind of a yellow in that case when we're cooking them. And finally, if my baked good was very gritty, coarse texture, this could have been due to too much sugar, too much baking powder, or inadequate mixing. Picture that cookie that you've bit into that only tastes like you're chewing on gritty sugar, and that's what you can go to there. Now that you've all made it through your cake and you're all ready for the Great British Baking Show, I think it's time to test you a little bit. How about some PQs? Number 1. A production line produced a dozen cakes for a party that all ended up having a fallen center. What was the likely cause? All right, all the cakes have a fallen center. Let's look at these 4 answers. Answer A, too little baking powder. I'm going to think of this as, okay, A, B, C, D, which ones am I going to eliminate? Well, it had a fallen center. What was the likely cause? Too little baking powder. Overcooking. I don't think it's overcooking. I don't think overcooking was what made it collapse in the center. If anything, undercooking would do that. So I'm going to eliminate B. Too much mixing. So I mixed my ingredients too much. No, I actually think undermixing may potentially lead to that fallen center. D, excess sugar and fat. Okay, I like D. So I'm stuck between A and D. Too little baking powder, excess sugar and fat. I am going to go with D as excess sugar and fat. Maybe my cake was just too moist in the center and collapsed in that case. Too little baking powder has the potential to cause it possibly if you didn't have enough leavener, but I think D is going to be my best fit here. Number 2. What purpose does gluten provide in baking properties? A, causing leavening and CO2 production. I don't know about that because is the gluten providing that leavening process or is it help trapping it? B, helps with binding and trapping leaveners. Okay, I like B. I'm going to rule out A here. C, provides salty taste to products. No, I don't think gluten's providing a salty taste. Or D, provides moisture to products. Well, I know when it's combined with water, it does help with moisture, but is that its ultimate goal? I don't think so. So I'm probably between A and B. It causes leavening and CO2 production, or it helps with binding and trapping of leaveners. And I think of that gluten network, that strong network that's trapping those leavener bubbles. I'm going to go with B as my best fit there, and it certainly would be the best one. A cake with a dry texture likely had problems with, dry texture here. Let's see what we think. Too much water. Would too much water cause it to be dry? I think it's going to be the opposite. I'm going to rule out A. B, too little egg. Not sure about that one. C, too much fat. No, I don't think too much fat would make it dry. I think too much fat would make it very moist. Or D, too much flour. Okay, so I'm between B and D, too little egg or too much flour. I picture too little egg would mean it's not a very stable structure, and too much flour would be too much dry. So I think D is going to be my best fit as a cake with a dry texture likely had a problems with too much flour in that case. That wraps up your lesson today. Let's hear about the good, the bad, and the ugly this week. We made our little trip to the farmer's market yesterday, and I had the inspiration to say, hey, let's look for some things at the farmer's market to make for dinner tonight. Maybe we can find everything here. My choices, because there's not a lot out there, was fresh mushrooms, kale, onion, and pork jowl that I got from a local butcher that was there. Pork jowl, by the way, is that cheek part of the pig. And one of our head chefs really recommended I go try this out. And then I saw him there getting the same thing. What we did was I combined my onions, some white onion, I combined some green onions, some kale, onions, mushroom, and vegetable broth to make a nice veggie-based soup, trying to be plant-based here. And then what I took was the jowl and I crisped up a couple slices of it, and we added it as just like a topping for the soup to provide a little bit of a texture. Keeping it mostly plant-based and using those animal-based proteins as more of a condiment than the center as we try to do. It was delicious and perfect for a cold Illinois night. That wraps us up for the Diet NPO podcast, everyone. Don't forget to rate, review, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Check on my Instagram, Zak_snacks, for any RD exam stuff coming up. And as always, everyone, happy studying.